You've been lied to. You were told that if you work efficiently, solve problems, and demonstrate your brilliance, you will be rewarded. But statistically, 82% of managers are completely unqualified for their roles. And to an insecure boss, your competence isn't a resource. It is a lethal threat. Every time you solve a problem they couldn't, you haven't helped them. You've exposed them. Today, we aren't just reading Schopenhauer. We are opening the historical playbook of how highly intelligent people leverage the psychology of the fool. Not just to survive them, but to use their egos against them to get exactly what you want. We need to talk about the mathematics of incompetence, because the math is against you. It is a concept deeply rooted in the Peter Principle, which states that within any corporate hierarchy, individuals are continuously promoted until they reach their respective level of incompetence. Statistical regression to the mean dictates that high technical performance frequently regresses to management incompetence. Gallup data and sweeping industry analytics confirm this terrifying reality. 8 out of 10 managers in the modern workforce are entirely accidental. They possess absolutely no fundamental leadership training, and 40% of them will completely fail within their first 18 months. So, you are not dealing with an anomaly. You are navigating a hierarchical structure where incompetency is a mathematical and structural inevitability designed to punish brilliance. We can look to the historical baseline established by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, that he defined the Philistine not merely as a person lacking intellect, but as someone whose primary, driving instinct in life is the desperate protection of their unearned rank. This creates a devastating paradox. Generating elegant solutions that your boss cannot perceive does not translate to career acceleration. It translates directly to career stagnation. Your intelligence triggers an immediate ego defense. This dynamic isn't just mildly irritating. It actively dictates the promotions denied to you and creates the suffocating environment shaping your daily existence. But if the data proves they are financially devastating to the company, why does the system actively protect them while neutralizing you? We have to acknowledge the crushing, profound exhaustion of playing dumb for 40 hours a week. But it requires a specific kind of agony to throttle your own capabilities, to actively dumb down your vocabulary, and to deliberately slow your processing speed just to avoid causing friction. You are paying what behavioral psychologists call the masking tax. This is the massive, unseen drain of cognitive energy spent performing normalcy. You are methodically curating your every output so that it doesn't accidentally trigger the deep-seated insecurities of the person signing your paycheck. You are burning out, not from the work itself, but from the theatrical performance required to survive the environment. To dismantle this, we must dissect the root cause. We are dealing with identity-disordered leadership. To an incompetent manager, their self-worth is entirely synonymous with their job title. They have no internal metric of value. But there is no separation whatsoever between who they are as a human being and the authority they hold in the org chart. Therefore, any flash of brilliance you demonstrate forces them into a state of acute learning anxiety. Because their identity is so fragile, they do not register your high performance as a strategic benefit to the department. Their central nervous system processes your competence as an active, biological threat to their survival. This brings us to the precise, devastating mechanism of your suffering. It is a documented psychological phenomenon known as top-down sabotage. When a highly intelligent subordinate understands a system significantly better than the leader instinctively leverages a weaponized tactic called source derogation. Their primary objective is to mitigate your growth ahead of time. You have experienced this in real time. It happens when your perfectly logical, mathematically sound, wildly efficient solution is suddenly and inexplicably labeled as non-constructive, or they claim it isn't aligned with the company culture, or they vaguely state that it lacks stakeholder synergy. Your manager isn't just missing the point of your brilliant idea. They are actively engaged in message derogation. They are deliberately twisting your logical framework and utilizing corporate jargon to preserve their illusory superiority. They find the exact social and interpersonal framing that allows them to make you the problem. They weaponize the bureaucracy against your efficiency. The hard data on this behavior is nothing short of chilling. 71% of all employees actively witness top-down sabotage in their workplaces. Well, the collateral damage is catastrophic, resulting in a 56% decrease in creative contribution across teams and a permanent 16% drop in overall corporate productivity. This is the brutal reality of the competence inversion. The harder you work, the more efficient you become, the more incredibly dangerous you appear to them, and the more dangerous you appear, the more aggressively, quietly, and systematically they must neutralize you to retain their own fragile illusion of power. It is an insidious cycle of systemic ego protection that financially guts the enterprise, while simultaneously destroying your ambition. You see, the masking tax doesn't just make you tired. It induces a state of chronic ego depletion. This depletion severely limits the functioning of your prefrontal cortex. But the sheer willpower required to nod along to strategic initiatives you know will inevitably fail bleeds directly into your personal life, leaving you creatively hollowed out. You are not just sacrificing your standard working hours. You are sacrificing your inherent neuroplasticity. The fundamental tragedy here is that you intrinsically assume everyone operates under the exact same logical parameters. You mistakenly assume that if you just present the flawless spreadsheet, the undeniable metrics, or the perfect code architecture, truth will naturally ascend. But in the dark ecosystem of top-down sabotage, truth is an invasive species. The identity-disordered leader views the truth as a ruthless declaration of war. They cannot allow you to be unequivocally right, because if you are perfectly right, they are suddenly obsolete. And because the antiquated corporate structure historically privileges static rank over raw intelligence, they have the institutional top cover required to suppress your ascension indefinitely. They don't need to outsmart you. They simply need to outrank you and leverage that unearned rank to enforce a mandatory institutionalized mediocrity that slowly suffocates your potential. When reason fails to penetrate identity, the intelligent mind makes its most dangerous, fatal miscalculation. But if logic tells us engagement is useless, why do we keep doing it? The answer lies in the darkest corner of our own compassion and in the inherent design of our own psychological blind spots. We understand the mechanics of the Dunning-Kruger effect as the inability of the incompetent to recognize their own staggering incompetence. It is universally known as the double curse. They literally lack the necessary perceptual apparatus required to understand just how poorly they are actually performing. Yet, armed with this knowledge, highly intelligent people continuously and tragically fall right into the empathy trap. You persist with perfectly calibrated explanations. You build increasingly complex flowcharts. You gather undeniable mountains of historical data. You mistakenly believe you can somehow save the incompetent leader from their own disastrous decisions. You operate under the desperate delusion that if you just explain the concept beautifully enough or concisely enough, the veil of ignorance will magically lift. But logic is an entirely useless weapon when their very psychological identity is built upon a hardened foundation of intentionally not understanding you. When their survival depends on missing your point, they will miss your point with absolute precision. Then comes the second failed attempt, which is the agonizing intellectual fencing match. You sit politely in a Zoom meeting, watching them completely dismantle your meticulously researched strategy. You try to publicly correct the manager who is actively employing what Schopenhauer defined as the heuristic dialectic. Under pressure, they pull the lever on a specific rhetorical trick known as the extension. This is the oldest, cheapest trick in the bureaucratic playbook. They take your highly nuanced, incredibly specific point, and they exaggerate it wildly. When they stretch your logic beyond recognition to make your valid argument sound absolutely ridiculous to the rest of the people on the call. It is a deeply manipulative, highly engineered theatrical performance designed specifically to isolate you from the herd. And what do you instinctively do? You take the bait. You argue back. You try to desperately defend the nuance. By doing so, you are merely hemorrhaging your finite intellectual capital to fight a losing battle of optics, not truth. Your only acceptable tactical response should be absolute silence. You do not attack their fractured logic in front of an audience. You preserve your unshakable authority over the viewers, entirely abandoning the worthless objective of dominating the opponent. But before we discuss dismantling their fragile architecture, But we must turn a devastating mirror around, because there is a profound, emerging vulnerability that high-performing individuals are walking directly into. Right now, we are witnessing the sharp, spectacular rise of the AI literacy paradox. Today's highly intelligent people are falling into the ultimate, seductive trap of rapid cognitive offloading. You are using large language models to execute tasks perfectly, draft flawless corporate strategies, and generate immaculate code in a fraction of the time. You look at these dazzling outputs, assume massive, undisputed intellectual superiority over your analog managers, and completely fail to realize you are actively building your own intelligence trap. You are fundamentally mistaking AI-assisted hyper-efficiency for personal, unassailable wisdom. Yet you are aggressively outsourcing your critical thinking, thereby slowly eroding the very neural pathways and cognitive advantages that separate you from the incompetent masses. You are becoming infected with a modern, devastating reverse Dunning-Kruger effect. By placing blind faith in external algorithms, you are becoming exactly as functionally blind and just as deeply reliant on external systems as the incompetent managers you so intensely despise. You are replacing your innate genius with imported automation, stripping away the mental friction required for actual mastery. You must deeply internalize that presenting exponentially higher quality work to a leader suffering from chronic incompetence is the equivalent of handing a loaded weapon to a dangerously paranoid adversary. It absolutely does not earn their respect. Yes, it merely activates their primal survival instincts. To them, perfection is aggressive. Competence is an unpardonable insult. And when you purposefully blind yourself with the false superiority of the AI literacy paradox, you wrongly assume your automated dominance provides you with an impenetrable, invisible shield. You assume raw output velocity will eventually break down the ancient walls of corporate bureaucracy. But algorithms do not understand vicious office politics, and large language models cannot defend you against an insecure executive carefully orchestrating a whispered smear campaign behind closed doors. By leaning fully into cognitive offloading, you sacrifice the very situational awareness essential for navigating the incredibly complex web of human frailty. You trade your vital emotional intelligence for synthetic speed, rendering yourself incredibly fast, but entirely defenseless against calculated human sabotage. This is the brutal pattern recognition you must relentlessly master to survive. This is absolutely why arguing back fails. This is exactly why trying to save them from themselves always fails. This is precisely why outproducing them with flawless work only accelerates your inevitable downfall. You are continuously trading untouchable gold for worthless dirt. You are taking your purest, most valuable cognitive capital and repeatedly exchanging it for the exhausted, deeply hollow satisfaction of being technically correct while remaining structurally, financially, and completely powerless. You are winning the meaningless debate in the conference room, but dramatically losing your own career trajectory in the process. What if logic is effectively dead, and producing better, faster output only paints a massive target on your back? How exactly does the superior mind extract tangible power from a mathematically rigged board? The paradigm must shift immediately and violently. You have to recognize the fundamental, irreconcilable difference between intelligence and power. Intelligence is merely performing for recognition. It is driven by the desperate, ego-driven need to prove that you are right, to have your brilliance openly validated by the very people whose incompetence threatens you. Power, on the other hand, is the cold ability to arrange outcomes seamlessly. It is silent, invisible, and completely detached from the desperate need for corporate applause. You must radically reprogram your core objective. You must stop aiming to teach and begin aiming to manage. You must treat the insecure manager not as a frustrating colleague to be reasoned with, but as a piece of deeply predictable, highly flawed machinery. They operate within securely established limits. They have specific ego inputs and highly predictable fear outputs. Once you realize they are a mechanism rather than a master, your emotional attachment to their validation immediately dies. History provides the ultimate blueprint for this psychological warfare. Look at Sima Yi, the brilliant ancient strategist who miraculously survived the brutal, lethal paranoia of warlord Cao Cao. Sima Yi engaged in masterful, relentlessly controlled self-presentation. He actively masked his formidable credentials. He spent years feigning physical illness, displaying deliberate, calculated self-doubt, and then carefully curating an unimpeachable image of non-threatening utility. He allowed lesser men to bask in the glory, knowing glory is often a death sentence. He unsheathed his sword and seized absolute power only when the game was already mathematically over. He neutralized the ambition threat by simply pretending he had no ambition. But Sima Yi is ancient history. We need to actively operationalize this concept for the modern cubicle, because waiting decades to strike doesn't work when you are forced to change jobs every 2.5 years just to secure a standard wage increase. This is precisely where we engineer the bridge and integrate the Talleyrand strategy. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand was the ultimate, untouchable political survivor, gracefully serving under the French monarchy, the Bloody Revolution, and Napoleon. His devastating secret was the art of respectful impertinence. He controlled the exact frame of information delivery. He made himself incredibly invaluable in the shadows, yet remained entirely elusive in the spotlight. You implement this today by utilizing a tactic called strategic naivety. You deliberately lower their primal defenses by dramatically softening your tone of absolute certainty. You immediately stop delivering finalized, perfectly polished masterpieces that trigger their deep-seated inferiority. Instead, you present 80% of the flawless solution, and you ask for their invaluable insight on the final 20%. You are actively engineering the Ben Franklin effect. You strategically ask your boss for small, entirely non-threatening favors, or highly specific, localized advice on minor, inconsequential issues. Well, this absolutely doesn't make you look weak or intellectually deficient. It forces their fragile ego to subconsciously justify their continued investment in you. Their brain rewires itself to stop viewing you as a lethal competitor and begins viewing you as their own hand-picked, valued protege. You are covertly manipulating their own psychological need for sheer dominance into a protective, bulletproof shield designed for your own career acceleration. You seamlessly combine this psychological hack with a framework we call clarity calibration. Instead of constantly over-delivering and inadvertently exposing their profound incompetence to upper management, you ask them exactly what they are prioritizing. You ask them to explicitly define the metric they desperately need to hit to impress their own boss. You create what is essentially a covert personal manual for navigating their specific anxieties. You execute precisely that single metric flawlessly, nothing more. But here is the secret. You use the remaining reserves of your massive intellect to quietly build your unassailable exit strategy, your lucrative side enterprise, or your untouchable secondary network. You let them comfortably believe they are directing the grand ship of the department, while you are quietly and efficiently stockpiling all the fuel for your own departure. You transform their suffocating micromanagement from a daily psychological torment into a predictable, manageable line item in your ultimate blueprint for escape. You trade your frustrating visibility for operational invincibility. If I hide my intelligence, how do I secure my next promotion or pivot out of this toxic team without looking completely average? You do it by ensuring your excellence is visible to exactly the right people at exactly the right time, completely circumventing their radar. You let your manager take the credit for the small battles, while you quietly position yourself to win the broader war. You become an indispensable ghost in the machine, selectively deploying your brilliance only when it directly serves your upward trajectory, never for the sake of mere validation. You learn to smile through the incompetence, perfectly aware that their mediocrity is actually the greatest camouflage your ambition could ever possibly hope for. You now possess the specific strategy to manipulate the machinery. But how do you protect your own neurological survival when they are actively threatening your livelihood? This is the ultimate evolution. We are relocating your entire consciousness from panicked participant to completely untouched observer. When you are sitting in the hostile room and the incompetent leader is frantically shifting blame, aggressively rewriting history, or engaging in unpredictable emotional posturing, you must instantly deploy the observer mindset. This isn't just a comforting philosophical metaphor. It is hard, quantifiable neuroscience. By consciously shifting from a reactive, emotional participant to a deeply detached observer, you are aggressively applying construal-level theory. You actively switch your entire internal monologue to a third-person narrative dialogue. You immediately initiate controlled, entirely imperceptible box breathing to steady your heart rate. What this specific physical protocol does is literally shut down the hyperactive threat response of your amygdala. It artificially prevents the chemical neurological hijack that makes you want to desperately scream or frantically defend yourself. Concurrently, it tightly preserves the high-level executive function and critical processing power of your lateral prefrontal cortex. You don't just magically feel calmer in the moment. You remain biologically, quantifiably, and structurally smarter than the red-faced person currently yelling at you. You watch the highly charged interaction the exact same way a trained naturalist observes a panicked primate in the wild. You watch with a sense of profoundly detached, clinical biological fascination. That you calmly note their aggressively puffed-up posture. You objectively observe the slight, terrified tremor in their voice, and the predictable, defensive deflection of blame onto others. You see it not as a devastating personal attack against your dignity or your hard work, but simply as a highly predictable neurological reflex from a terrified organism actively trying to protect its unearned territory. But heed this final, incredibly critical warning. Do not ever mistake your polite deference for any form of true psychological weakness. Your politeness, your calm compliance in these incredibly tense moments, is exactly what Schopenhauer ominously referred to as the false coin. It is completely counterfeit currency that you are willingly and knowingly handing over to a beggar. It is a highly calculated, heavily strategic expense paid out solely to avoid burning down your own corporate house. You are calmly paying the minor toll to cross the rickety bridge, fully and secretly aware that the person aggressively collecting that toll is a complete fool with no future. The greatest, most inherently cynical truth of professional survival is finding ultimate liberation through radical, unapologetic acceptance. You must fundamentally accept the reality that people rarely, if ever, change their baseline character. The magical moment you finally stop making the impossible, deeply exhausting demand that a fool suddenly develops the capacity to understand your brilliance. The crushing exhaustion simply evaporates from your shoulders. You purposefully drop the agonizing, childish illusion of the corporate meritocracy. But you coldly accept the world exactly as it is, governed almost entirely by rampant ego, profound fear, and institutionalized, staggering mediocrity. By embracing commiseration grounded in the reality of human limitation, you cut the emotional anchor chaining you to their incompetence. You are now truly, dangerously free. You are free to be phenomenally excellent in private, free to finally decouple your inherent self-worth from their deeply broken, weaponized performance metrics. You begin to wield your formidable capability, not as a desperate, pleading performance begging for a temporary gold star from a blind judge, but as a silent, devastatingly effective weapon hidden entirely in plain sight. You must internalize that true intellectual supremacy does not require an audience. The need to be recognized is a vulnerability, an emotional tax levied against the brilliant by the mediocre. Once you sever that dependency, you ascend beyond the reach of their petty sabotage. You transcend the office politics entirely, operating on a frequency they are biologically incapable of intercepting. Stop asking your intelligence to constantly prove itself to a room full of people biologically incapable of recognizing it. Start aggressively commanding that very intelligence to quietly serve everything you want to build. Because the truth is, the most dangerous, lethal mind in the room never even announces its presence until the game is already comprehensively won.